Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure for me to be here with you. So I was asked to talk to you about cities in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So how have cities emerged out of the pandemic? What are cities working on? And what does the future hold for cities? I think the big question that happened, the pandemic transmitted initially in urban areas. There was a lot of discussion as to whether cities were the cause of the spread of pandemics, of contagion, and whether cities will manage to survive this or not. So the pandemic has had a major economic impact on cities. So as a result of the spread of the pandemic, many economic activities ended up closing. And we could actually track this very well. And the way we did it is those pictures you see on the right-hand side. These are night lights images, and the intensity of the light is a proxy for economic activities. So this is the city of Wuhan, again, the epicenter of the pandemic. And as you see, the intensity of the light with a span of 2 weeks, you see that the economic activities in the city dimmed quite a bit, which is basically how we know, about the closure or the opening or the expansion or the contraction of economic activities. It's a quick proxy. And the impact on cities was such, but even more so was the impact on informal workers. Globally, there's 2 billion informal workers. And obviously their jobs and livelihood was severely affected. And as a result of the losses of jobs, the decline in economic activities, there's been a significant expansion in poverty, and our estimates is at least 100 million people were pushed into extreme poverty. Now, besides the economic impact, cities were also financially very much affected. Because on the one hand, economic activities closing and job losses means less tax revenues that cities are collecting. And at the same time, on the other hand, the cost of service delivery is becoming higher. So cities were both contracting on the revenue side and faced with additional obligations on the expenditure side. We basically looked at a variety of cities, and this is a combination of projections, and most of the cities we've worked with had a budget that was contracting between 15 to 30%, and in some cases, in capital investment, the contraction went as far as 60%. Now, there are other cities, for instance, Barcelona, it was a 10% decline in revenue. New York was about 12%. A city like Albania, Tirana, Albania, actually managed to, its revenues increased because, there was much more licensing, for instance, for construction activities. But for the large part, cities were hit pretty badly. In addition, one of COVID's impact on cities was the inequalities that have increased. So this graph below shows you the inequality in terms of access to vaccines, but the inequalities that were faced in cities were much more than just access to vaccines and health services. This is a graph of a study that we did in Jakarta, in Indonesia. And one of the impacts of COVID-19 was a differential impact affecting the urban poor. So the rich, So we analyzed basically mobility of people by income group. Rich people in Jakarta could afford to stay at home, could afford to work from home. Their children could afford to do online studies. The poor, on the other hand, especially those working in the informal sector, could not afford to do that. So we noticed a major difference in mobility. The poor continued to commute, looking for jobs, basically risking contagion. The rich could afford to stay at home. Next slide. And I think this is more or less the images with the cities that we've seen. Different stages, in places like Africa and otherwise, you have to go to fetch water, you have to go to look for a job. This is a famous picture of Indian workers, basically relocating back to the villages because of the loss of livelihoods. So the impact on the poor was much harder, and we could see that in many different ways. Yeah. We also saw other unintended consequences of COVID. One is, significant improvement in air quality in cities. Of course, economic activities declined, lockdown were introduced, transportation in many cities was reduced significantly, and there are suddenly cities like Delhi, like Cairo, like Mexico, where you can see a blue sky. This never happened before. The other thing, again, a situation that was rather unexpected, was related to rent increases. So some of the most expensive cities in the world, Singapore, London, New York, Sydney, rents were increasing very highly. And then suddenly with the pandemic, people were looking to avoid places of density. People could afford to telecommute, so were looking for houses in the periphery. We saw in the beginning rents stabilizing or declining, although 1 year later, rents were coming back to increasing 30 and 40% per year. So this was a short-lived phenomenon. Yeah. So in a nutshell, the way cities faced the COVID pandemic was at 3 different levels. The first level was the emergency phase, which is how do we provide health services? How do we care for the poor? How do we convert libraries to become hospitals and COVID testing centers? The test tracing, all that stuff, emergency response. And how do you maintain service delivery? I mean, you still have to collect the garbage every day in a context of a pandemic or not. The second stage was cities focusing on categories of the vulnerable people. So how do you support the poor, those who lost their livelihoods and jobs? How do you provide social safety net, maybe food distribution, cash transfers for the poor? How do you support the elderly? How do you support those who are immunosuppressed, etc.? And then the third level is the planning for the post-recovery. So there's emergency intervention across the city, close businesses, adjust facilities, etc. There's focused interventions, and then the day after. So putting things in context with the urbanization in Central Asia, which in many ways also reflects some of the elements of the urbanization also in Kazakhstan, we know that cities are important drivers of economic growth. But at the same time, we know that this growth, because usually cities have people migrating from rural areas to urban areas, they come looking for jobs, they come looking for better services, and gradually people make their way out of poverty, especially if the city is well managed. But in a context where urbanization is not well managed, and especially in a time of challenge like COVID, that relationship with cities becoming a conduit out of poverty alleviation becomes challenged. Next. The next thing we know about cities is how they grow. So here there's a combination of growth in the center through densification, but also a rapid urban expansion at the periphery, what is commonly referred to as sprawl. We also know that because the economy is highly energy intensive, and because of the configuration of cities and their sprawl, we know that cities over here are an important source of greenhouse gas emissions and tend to face several of the challenges related to environmental sustainability, most notably the poor air quality. And we know as well on the national territory and within urban areas, there tends to be inequalities, that become even more pronounced when the governance is more centralized. So again, you get different stages of countries and different stages of decentralization, and we know usually that decentralization tends to be associated with better quality service delivery, better understanding of the needs of local populations. So this also is another challenge, but also within the national territory, we know that there are places that are left behind that are struggling more. So against this context, let's switch to what several of the cities that we work with and that we observe have done in terms of managing their recovery from COVID, and draw some parallels to what could be lessons learned or lessons applied in Almaty, in other cities in Central Asia. So this is a couple of cases of cities that we worked with very closely. So there are some blogs that I wrote with some of the mayors. So this is the city of Helsinki, the capital of Finland. And Helsinki's strategy was to be a so-called functional city. They want to be the most functional city in the world. Now with that, what they mean by that is to look to make Helsinki the best place to work, to live, to play in a safe environment. And how to do that is by delivering high quality services to everyone, rich or poor, visitor or resident. And they worked on 3 pillars. The first is that of a smart city, so using technology and innovation as a foundation to better deliver services more efficiently. The second is an inclusive city, so a city that focuses on not just having the best schools, but what they say as the best worst schools. Meaning, when you go to the poorest neighborhoods, there's not a big gap between the quality of education there and that in the richer neighborhoods. And the third was to focus on making their city more sustainable, and especially by maintaining the course on carbon neutrality by 2035. This is a combination of phasing out the coal in power generation, going towards more renewables, and improving the quality of life, especially with mobility, public transportation, and also active mobility. Now, the city used these 3 elements of its strategy as the foundation for its recovery. So it took out of COVID the importance of inclusion, because if there are inequalities in the city in a time of a crisis like this, if you will, the legitimacy of government gets threatened. They also, again, their ability, because there is trust between the city and the citizen, they could leverage technology even more so for service delivery. I mean, basically, the citizen in Helsinki allows the city and the government to collect an amazing amount of data about their behavior, etc. But that's because there is trust that this data is used properly. And then staying the course, I mean, again, as they moved towards hybrid work, as mobility was reduced, they could, scale up investment in mobility. This is another city we work with, again, as a partner rather than as a client of the World Bank, Barcelona. And Barcelona, took the opportunity, so COVID was a crisis for them. As I said, about 10 to 15% drop in revenues, but it was a moment that allowed them for a rethink. What are the key challenges in the city that they could tackle in a post-COVID recovery? Now, the first one for Barcelona was the digital divide. This is a city where 94% of the population has access to internet, but there's a good 6% who are poor or elderly that do not have access. And there's also people who have, access, let's say, to internet, but their phones, they don't have smartphones. So in other words, that access is curtailed. So they focused a lot on addressing that digital divide by providing targeted solutions for those who are, left out of the digital economy, because service delivery comes there, economic opportunities come there, etc. The second thing, Barcelona, as you can imagine, receives an amazing amount of tourists per year relative to its population. I think they receive 20 times as many tourists that they have people living. And this caused an affordable housing crisis in the city. Everybody's, putting their housing in Airbnb. It's a city becoming very expensive, and there is a crisis in housing affordability. So they decided to tackle that with COVID by regulating short-term rentals and investing in affordable housing. And the third is, they decided to invest in improving access to to public space and to green space. So they closed off a lot of streets, transformed them into public spaces, and basically reconsidered the mobility to give access to more opportunities for public and green space for people. Thank you. So those two examples carry some ideas of what cities have done or used their COVID recovery towards. Now, the next few slides are a bit more transversal themes. So first, COVID has showed us that the future of work is much more about hybrid work environment. So before COVID, in most OECD countries, we were talking about 20% of people working 20% of their time remotely. After COVID, these figures jumped to 60% of people working in a hybrid format, about 40% of their time. So there's a shift towards more hybrid work arrangement. It's neither staying at home nor going to work 5 days a week, but it's becoming a mix in between. But at the same time, that has a transformation on the traditional city. So before, a city used to be organized around where is the central business district, where the jobs are, where the office space is, and the housing market was basically a declining rent gradient from there, meaning the closer you are to the city center, the downtown, the place where the jobs are, is the more expensive the housing, the smaller the housing, etc. So it's about proximity to where the jobs are. Now this dynamic is changing, because now if you need to go to work maybe 2 days a week, you might not be as worse off by a longer commute if the remaining 3 days a week, you live into an area of more amenities. So basically the classic configuration of a city of, rental values increasing the more you approach the city center become reconsidered depending on the city. And at the same time, we know that demand for office space declined. We know that many corporate employers started asking for short-term leases, and basically rental, especially commercial rents, are dropping. But this does not mean that the city in its traditional form is going to be changed. This is changing a certain static configuration of the city, but it's creating, if you will, cities or push for cities that are much more polycentric, etc. And at the same time, it's not that because COVID happened or contagion happens in cities that this demise of the city was starting. If you think about it, cities faced many challenges in the past, including plagues, cholera, etc. And the result was that the city continued to innovate. The sewers were introduced, the toilets were introduced. A lot of innovations happened as cities were facing crises in their rebound. So this is the expectation also of cities progressing. But for instance, the hybrid work arrangement will depend really on the type of a job. Creative type jobs thrive on proximity between people. Managerial type jobs, the same thing. There are much more other types of jobs that could be, for instance, if you will, basic administrative jobs, etc. These could lend themselves towards, being done remotely, perhaps with less loss. So there's a change in the configuration of work, in the future of work, that is going to result in innovations within cities. And in this context, the quality of the urban space, the quality of the space where people work, the quality of neighborhoods, the ability to create places where people can co-create, can work in much more attractive work environment becomes, if you will, one of the amenities or the draws that could offset, if you will, the challenges of being in an office. So investing in making the workplace hybrid, a place that invests much more in leisure opportunities, in amenities, is becoming one of the directions by which, for instance, downtowns are evolving. At the same time, the flexibility of the use of space is equally important. So the logic of your downtown that's 9 to 5 and which dies completely when people return to their houses is starting to change. You have inner cities in London, in other places where people, office space demand is declining, and the conversion of office space into residential facilities is starting and resulting in much more mixed use type of activities. So again, you're replacing traditional functions of a city with a different built environment. Another area of attention that has increased is the notion of land use planning and basically development and planning regulations. So again, there's much more emphasis on creating foundations for integrated planning across sectors, across uses, about improving the quality of infrastructure in underserviced neighborhoods, about regulating certain types of facilities within cities where, some of the challenges like the pandemics existed. So, abattoirs, wet markets, live animal markets, etc., became suddenly, their regulation and their safe operation became very important. Rethinking public spaces and, mobility became important. So suddenly narrow sidewalks, are not very good for social distancing, but also, having a wider sidewalk is good for livability as well. So it's a combination of safety and livability. And then starting to think about planning the peri-urban fringe. It's that space where urban meets rural, thinking about, land uses and the management of these areas. This is probably the most obvious one, which is, again, the pandemic, working from home, studying from home, the need to socially distance, etc., give a major impetus to investing in upgrading digital infrastructure. Housing, both affordable housing, quality housing became very critical as well. I think the pandemic revealed a lot about, what poor housing quality or unaffordable housing means in terms of, if you will, challenges. So in, places like Africa and Middle East and, parts of Asia as well, the poor housing standards, especially in the slums and in the informal settlements, became a major factor associated with the rise of the spread of contagion. But also, you're seeing right now, in these past year plus, you're seeing a crisis in housing affordability in lots of places in the world. So a combination of being able to afford housing and being able to have certain minimum standards of housing quality became critically important. Another challenge that cities faced is the challenge of supply chains. So where is food coming into cities? Are they predominantly relying on imports? You have seen a lot of disruptions to supply chains, that have led, many cities to reconsider, where they're, basically many cities expanded urban agriculture, or, and economies as well in terms of, supporting, if you will, food production to ensure food safety. Yeah. And then lastly, the notion of also strengthening local governance. So taking an opportunity of a crisis to empower local governments, to give them much more, if you will, levers in terms of responsibilities, but also in terms of financial resources so that they can deliver services to the population. Not really a pandemic, but if you look at Indonesia, when it went through the financial crisis in 1998, the Asian financial crisis, started a process of decentralization, empowering local governments, giving them resources, responsibilities, and which resulted over the long term in much higher portions of service delivery happening with better satisfaction to citizens and with much more responsiveness to the needs and the priorities of the people. And of course, COVID was only one crisis. In fact, it was a big crisis because it was the first time in almost 20 years that the progress on reducing poverty was interrupted. It was the first time we have a reversal, poverty increasing. But COVID, I'm sure you've seen the cartoon, COVID is nothing compared to the big crisis that we're about to face, which is climate change. It's happening with much more magnitude. I'm pretty sure you will have seen the pictures of the floods in Pakistan over the past 2 days, unprecedented floods. This is basically about glaciers that are melting and tremendous amounts of water going into valleys, erasing everything, including 8 and 10-story buildings. This is not, this so-called 1 in 1,000 year event is now happening every 2 years. So we're living in a different era, and therefore COVID, and with it the focus on recovery at national level and at local level, should also be combined as an opportunity to rethink the climate crisis and to think about how cities can reduce their emissions relative to business as usual, and take the opportunity to achieve a recovery that's both inclusive and green and resilient. Now, one of the questions that was asked about cities was whether cities were going to grow more dense, less dense. I think this evoked a lot of discussions. On the one hand, there is a benefit to having dense cities that work well. This is better access to jobs, better access to amenities, specialized services, economies of scale. That happens with agglomeration. But there's also, when cities are not managed well, there are many costs to that poorly managed urbanization. It's congestion, crime, lack of affordable housing, air pollution, and so on and so forth. So in this regard, the big question of what is the future of cities post-COVID is in many ways how will cities manage that trade-off between reinforcing the benefits of agglomeration, of living in a city that is compact, that is livable, where mobility is well managed, versus reducing the costs associated with badly managed urbanization in terms of pollution, crime, lack of affordability, etc. And these are examples, of that show you that, density was not, if you will, the underlying issue with COVID. It was more how badly managed that density was. So even, we did a study very early on with the pandemic. We looked at Chinese cities. The worst affected Chinese cities were not the largest ones. They were not the densest one. They were actually, so there was much fewer cases in the Beijings and Shanghais than there were in the small and medium-sized cities where, if you will, there's less services, there's less, quality of, if you will, healthcare, etc. The same thing, you can look at two places that have similar population densities, and the most striking pair is Manhattan, on the one hand, has the same number of people per square kilometer than the big slum in Mumbai called Dharavi. If you've seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire, that's where that slum is. So they have the same number of people per square kilometers, but they have very different built environment. One place, Manhattan, has 4 times the floor space than Dharavi has. Not to mention the difference in the quality of that floor space. But that's why two places that might have the same number of people per surface area will have very, very different outcomes in terms of contagion, because what is that quality of the built environment in between these places? So I think, again, you will have heard also quite a bit about the so-called 15-minute city. I mean, that's one of the ideas that are emerging quite a bit in a context of a post-pandemic recovery. And this is the idea of trying to think a closer proximity between where people live, where they work, the essential services they need, where they play, where they get their leisure. A good idea in general, although some of the critics have very clearly highlighted that you also don't want to end up with losing the most important benefit of the city, which is your ability to access a very large number of jobs within 45 minutes, 60 minutes, etc. If the city returns to becoming like a village, then you lose a major benefit of the city, not to mention that you create socioeconomic inequalities. Because if the rich, access the jobs within their city, the poor access the jobs within their city, and you don't have that mobility that creates, the much more fluid and larger labor market, you lose a lot at the same time. Of course, rethinking mobility was one of the major things. You will have heard the first thing cities did in a post-pandemic. As the traffic shrunk, they started converting road space into bicycle lanes. Bogota did, something like 84 kilometers of bicycle lanes in 3 months, which suddenly expanded its network by 50% literally in 3 months. And many cities did that. Lots of other cities widened sidewalks. Many cities allowed restaurants and functions to expand on public space, creating a much more livable city. So taking space from roads, giving it to people, is in general a very good idea. And the example of this, if you think about it, basically for those of you who are planners or architects, a car, when you design a parking space, you say 2 meters by 5 meters. When the car is moving, you basically take into account that the car consumes 30 square meters of road space, which is what it needs before it and behind it to move without making accidents. So if one car that's transporting one person, needs 30 square meters of road space to move, imagine taking that amount of space and giving it to people, or first taking as many people, putting them in buses, or in trams, or in metros, or putting them in sidewalks or in bicycle lanes. So there's much better uses of public space, for mobility than, car usage, if you want. And of course, not to mention the impact of active mobility on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Lastly, and this became very critical, is the notion of, to what extent were cities prepared to deal with crises and emergencies like the pandemic. So we have basically 3 types of cities. We had cities that were totally unprepared for either for natural hazards nor pandemics. We had cities who were very well prepared for natural hazards, meaning a flood or an earthquake, etc. They have these types of preparation, but were flat-footed when they were caught with a pandemic. And then we had other types of cities that had, if you will, better contingency planning for pandemics, but these were much more of the minority. So I think the combination of the pandemic, but also the impacts of climate change and what it means in terms of increasing intensity and increasing frequency of disasters, is getting much more cities to invest in becoming better prepared to deal with emergencies and with crises. So they set up emergency operating centers. They think about risk financing strategies where they set aside some money from the budget to deal with emergencies. They better train their civil defense authorities. They have plans for, if you will, the delivery of services in the context of a crisis. They have plans for conversion of facilities. They have plans, to stockpile certain types of, if you will, medications, etc. But the idea of how can cities be better prepared when the next shock arrives, whether it's, an extreme weather event or a public health pandemic, how can they better react to this? So these, if you want, are more or less many of the directions that we've observed cities head towards or state that they're becoming their priority as they prepare for the post-pandemic recovery. And I think that was my last slide.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.